Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch. We are getting ready to dig up and store our dahlias. As you can see, it is fall and all the leaves are off the trees. It is getting cold, and so we've let our dahlias get frost killed, and we're gonna go ahead and dig them up. And this is the reason why dahlias are not my favorite flower. As beautiful as they are and as lovely as they are when they're blooming, they are so much work in my zone. So if you are zone 8 or below or colder, then you're going to have to do this process and dig them up. Now you can try to overwinter them if you want to, but that can be a little bit complicated, and there are some disclaimers that go along with that. We're going to talk about those things, and we're also going to talk about storage and digging. This is part 1. Part 2 is going to be long-term storage. This is digging and the initial cure time for dahlias. Let's go. We have been hit by 2 or 3 good hard frosts, and we are waiting always to dig our dahlias until after we get hit by those frosts. And the reason is because we're in zone 5-6, we have to store for a long time. So we are storing our dahlia tubers here for 7, sometimes 8 months, depending on when we get hit by our first frost. And that's a really long time to be storing tubers. So the longer we can leave them in the ground, the better. Getting hit by a frost actually helps those tubers to convert the starches and the sugars that are in the stems and the foliage, and they take it down into the tubers. It stores that starch until the next spring, and so it just helps them to cure. It helps them to store better if we can wait until after they've been hit by the frost. But that doesn't mean you have to wait. Now, if you're in a zone that doesn't get frost, or maybe a very wet zone that gets frost and then immediately a lot of rain, then maybe it might be best if you go ahead and dig them up before they get hit by frost. So in general, you want to make sure you leave them in the ground for at least 120 days. That's to be able to reach their full maturity and be able to store and develop eyes and energy for the following year. So 120 days is your rough guideline, but if you can wait until after frost, I recommend waiting. So right now we have Roosevelt and Midnight and Savannah and Dawn over there helping to cut down the dahlias. So we wait to cut down until right before we're going to dig, and the reason for that is because the stems are hollow. So let's take a look at the stems. So some people recommend cutting these down before you anticipate digging. So they'll say cut these about a week or 2 before you're going to dig, and the theory behind that is because cutting them sends a message to the tubers to develop eyes, so it's easier to see the eyes if you're going to divide. The reason that we like to wait to cut these down until right when we're going to dig is because of the hollowness of this stem. So if you get precipitation, snow, or rain in the time between when you cut them and when you dig them, moisture precipitation gets down into this hollow stem, and it goes all the way down to the tuber where it can actually rot this tuber. So that often leads to rot in the storage phase. So this is why we wait to cut these stems until right before we are getting ready to dig. So you can see we're just cutting them now. So you can see we have gotten all of the dahlias cut down. We are starting to dig them up. So we're going to show you how to do that. Basically, what we want to keep in mind is that we want to try to avoid breaking or puncturing the dahlia tubers, so we're giving them plenty of space around the perimeter. We're also using a fork to dig instead of a shovel, which can help because sometimes shovels just penetrate the whole surface where forks kind of loosen the soil. So we're trying to loosen the soil around the tuber first and then dig. Okay, so once we've got the dahlia popped up and out of the soil, we're just going to gently lift. I like to make sure that I'm grabbing from beneath. If you grab from these stems, sometimes it can tear the dahlia. So make sure that you're giving it plenty of support as you're lifting it up and out of the ground. And then what we do here is we just try to clean off as much of this clay as we can, because we have pretty heavy clay soils. That's good and bad for dahlias. So it's good because it helps these dahlias actually multiply. That's because our soils are really rich in minerals and nutrients. The downside is digging for dahlias is hard, which is why I'm out of breath. Digging for dahlias in our zone is a little bit tricky with our soil. But what we do is we mostly clean off as much of the soil as we can. There's lots of worms in here, so you also want to get those back into the dirt. And then we're going to just pack them in since we have all that soil cleared away. We really don't do any washing of our tubers. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that the water supplies are so limited that it's such a precious resource. It seems pretty wasteful to use it washing off dahlias. But the other reason is we just find that leaving a little bit of the soil on here actually helps provide a little bit of protection. But it is up to you which one you decide to do. One thing that we do want to make sure that we're doing is that we're cutting down, as we mentioned, these hollow stems. So when we're putting these into storage, sometimes the water can't be hanging out in these stems, so we want to make sure that we're cutting down to where the stem is solid. So depending on varietal, it will be higher up or lower down the stem. So what I usually do is I just kind of start to cut, still hollow, and here we have solid stem. So now that it's solid, we can stop cutting. There's not going to be water sitting in there as we take them into storage. So we'll just cut down all of these stems. And we do try to leave a little bit of the stem, and that's just because sometimes eyes will develop up here on the stem. So this is where the eyes sometimes will pop out. So if we cut off the stem all the way down to tuber level, then we could be removing some of the eyes. We're gonna leave this soil on for the storage process, which we'll talk about next. Okay, so we have dug up a bunch of our dahlias, not quite all, but a lot of them. And I just want to point out a couple things to look for and a couple things to do to prep these when going into storage. So one of the things I mentioned that we do is that we leave the dirt on. So there are different trains of thought on this. You can wash them off. We just like to get our dirt as dry as possible before it's time to dig. And then what we can do is we can just flake off the dirt like this. The reason I prefer to do this personally is because we follow a lot of potato storage recommendations when we're storing our dahlias, because dahlia tubers are very similar to potatoes. So when we look up how to store storage potatoes for long-term storage, the recommendation is to not wash, just because of the introduction of mold and rot that comes with. So we are leaving these dry. We're just kind of, you can see I'm kind of just brushing off most of this dirt. And this is about as much as I'll do. So I'm going to show you kind of the close-up of what this guy is looking like. It does still have a little bit of dirt. Oops, we've got a worm stuck in here. You do want to be gentle when you're brushing it off, especially in between the clumps, because you can break necks on the tubers by doing that. So we're just doing it very carefully. And again, this is why it's good if you do it when your soil is dry. Once we have all that dirt kind of brushed off, now I'm going to do a trim of the stem. So we already cut these stems down a little bit in the field, but what I want to point out is what's happening on the stem of this dahlia in particular. So if you can see what's happening here, there is some rot that has begun to happen in this stem. So even though we haven't been getting much precipitation, think of this like a cavity. Precipitation, if any moisture is down in that stem, and that can just happen just from cutting it, if any precipitation is down in there, it will start to rot. And if we start to get rot down and into the center, like I said, it's like a cavity. So if we have a cavity in our tooth and we don't get it filled or drilled out, then what happens is it rots the tooth. So same thing can happen to our tubers in storage. So if you're starting to see any rot happening in that stem, you want to drill it out just like you would a cavity on a tooth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back the stem all the way to where there is no longer rot. I'm using my nice sharp Velcros, which actually need to be derusted a little bit. So you can see I cut off a little bit and there's still just a little bit of dark spot in there. So that's still rot. So I want to cut down even below that. Okay, so now I have a nice green unrotted stem. So this looks good. So we can store. Now, if there was any more darkness going on in there, you could continue to cut, and you could actually even continue to cut until this stem is solid. So you can see there's still a little bit of a little hole in there. I'm fine with that. As long as it's not rotted, I'm gonna let this cure over in the cooler. So the other thing that we want to look for before we put these away to store, and we do store them just like this in clumps. I don't really divide them unless there's a very natural or easy division to make, is any wounds that happen during the digging process and any broken parts of the tuber. So as you can see with this tuber, we have a couple of wounds that happened during digging. So this tuber got cut in half. So that wound will probably heal over. I'm actually just gonna give it a fresh trim, and this wound will cure. It will heal over in our storage process, so I'm gonna leave that. But if we have any pieces that have been kind of nicked or the necks have been broken, so when we're looking at a tuber, this one you can see is floppy, its neck has been broken, so we're gonna just nip that guy off. We don't wanna leave that on in storage. Let's see if there's any others that had necks broken. Just to show you, usually if you give it a shake, you can kind of tell because it'll wobble. So here's one where the neck broke. So you can see it's wobbly here where the neck broke. So we're gonna nip that one off as well. And then what I do is I go around and I look for any tubers on the clump that are smaller than a pencil, and I remove those. And then I also remove these dangly root hairs, just because I found those are things that are likely to rot when we put these in storage. So I'm just gonna trim off dangling roots here. Very nice clean pair of clippers is key. Pieces that are smaller than a pencil, some of these end roots, I'll nip off. And then if your mother tuber is very obvious, so the mother tuber is the first tuber that you planted on the tuber. So usually it's a little bit darker. Let's see if we can find the mother on this one. It's not jumping out at me, but I'm suspecting it's this center one. This one actually looks pretty good. Sometimes the mother will be the first one to rot, and often it will have even rotted in the ground before you dig it. So if you want to, you can remove that mother tuber and remove any that are just looking rough or like they're not gonna make it. So these ones have pretty small necks. So when we're looking at the neck size, I like the neck to be at least larger than a pencil. These necks are all smaller, so they're probably not gonna make it through storage. They might lead to rot, so I'm just gonna take those off. Being careful not to nick any other tubers. This one's a little floppy. I'm suspecting the neck is broken, so I'll probably take that one off as well. All right, so this guy's pretty well cleaned up for storage now. This is looking pretty good. So let's look at a couple of things you also want to look for after you dug them up, and we're going to look at dahlia disease, specifically gall. So this is part of the reason why I actually prefer to not overwinter my dahlias. Woo. So even if I were able to in my zone, I would probably dig up my tubers, just because even though I'm 3 years in of storing my own tubers, I still every once in a while find a dahlia stalk that has gall, or a tuber that has gall. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Gall in a tuber is usually spread via the tissue. So if there's, if you were cutting these and you cut one of these stems and you cut a neighboring tuber that was not infected, you can infect that neighboring tuber with this gall. So when you dig up, it's actually fairly easy to tell in the fall. So this is one of the reasons why I like to wait until after frost, because after frost, these eyes will start to pop out and be more visible. So these kind of start to sprout and regrow, and that's when we can see the gall. So I'm gonna just zoom in here so you can see exactly what gall looks like. It looks like these little cauliflowery bits. It looks like lots and lots of little sprouts, but they kind of have this cauliflowery texture. And it's unfortunate because this is a really nice looking clump, okay? But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and discard this whole tuber, this whole clump, and we also wanna disinfect our shears. So we wanna disinfect our shovel, we wanna disinfect if we used our clippers on it at all before we notice the gall. And here's another one. I just wanted to show you a second example. And this is the same variety. So I'm suspecting something might have happened with this supplier. We actually bought from another farm this year and might have come in on that stock. So you can see how these ones have started to resprout, but you can see how the sprouts are very prolific. So it's not just that it's sprouting, it's that there's a lot of sprouting happening in a small area. And if I clear away some more of this dirt, you'll see some of that cauliflowering happening down there. So that is what we are looking for when we are looking for those signs of gall. Let's see if there's anything else suspicious on here. I think that's it. So we're gonna discard both of those. If our shears touch it, we're gonna disinfect them. All right, let's talk about how we're gonna store these next. Okay, so now that I have my dahlias as clean as I'm going to get them before I'm going to put them into storage, I'm going to pop them into our cooler. Now, most of you don't have a cooler. If you do have a walk-in cooler, you want to pop a humidifier in there depending on your climate. Now, obviously, not all of you have a walk-in cooler. So if you don't have a cooler, find a small room, a nice cold room in your house, a crawl space, or another area that you can humidify for a little bit of time while these guys cure. And then we'll talk about how to handle the humidity issue during storage in our next video. Here in Colorado, it's super dry, so I have to add a humidifier, and I especially want to add a humidifier during this stage, so the curing process. Remember that we cut down those stems, and then we also cut off some other things if there were wounds on these tubers, so we want to let those wounds cure. So we're going to follow our potato storage again, and we're going to pop these guys into a very humid space for about 2 weeks, and we're going to keep them around 50-55 degrees, so a little warmer than storage, and we're going to keep them at a super high humidity, so around 90 to 95% humidity. We have a light on in here, but actually we're going to want to store these tubers in the dark just because that's going to be the best for them. So you can see this humidifier is really doing its job right now in here. It is about 90 degrees relative humidity, and we're sitting right at about 53 degrees Fahrenheit. So what that's doing is that's allowing these tubers to heal over those wounds. So those little cuts that we just made are going to cure really well in this nice high humidity, and they're not going to dry out and wrinkle in the meantime. So those are two key things to consider, is that these are not drying as they're in the curing stage. You can see these actually already have a nice skin on them from letting them be in the ground as long as possible. They are not pale and white looking like a scoured potato. They actually have a nice skin on them. So that's gonna help them store a little bit better. We're going to leave them in this super humid environment here for about 2 weeks. So we're trying to dig as many as we can at the same time because we want these in here for 2 weeks. Then we're going to take down the humidity just a bit, so it's going to be about 85% humidity, and we're going to take down the temperature to about 40 degrees for the rest of the storage. We're going to talk about storage next, so make sure you subscribe below if you want to tune in to see how we store ours and a couple other options too.